I'm Sallie Saunders from Building Better Boards, and I have worked with and for non-profit organisations for 45 years now. I hesitate to say that too often. I'm actually using the microphone. Is that any better? Little bit, okay. I'll use the microphone and shout, and we'll see how that goes. If you just wave if I've faded, that would be good. Okay, the last 10 years of that has been as a consultant, and the previous 14 or 15 as an academic at the University of Technology, Sydney, teaching and researching in the field. Before that, I was a senior public servant funding some of you guys, and before that I worked in non-profit organisations. I think the public service recruited me to shut me up, but I didn't last very long. And being an academic was a lot more fun. But working as a consultant has been incredibly fulfilling too. So I enjoy my work. In fact, I love my work. I talk about it all the time. Assessing the CEO is something that I'm often asked to assist boards with, and I have seen lots of different forms of practice in this field, and I can share some of those experiences with you. But who in the room is a CEO? Who in the room is just a board member charged with assessing the CEO? Yes, not both. Yeah, and who in the room is both? Right, so there's a couple of you on both sides of the question. Yeah, interesting field we work in. Okay, I'll start with my thoughts about this whole role of being the CEO and what I view as the role of the board in relationship to the CEO, and we'll see how we go. In my view, the job of the CEO can be sort of generically described in these terms. I mean, there are individual differences depending on the size of the organisation, and I'm really aware that the demographics that come to these conferences start at about under 250,000 and go to 40, 50 million plus. So there's a lot of scope there. But keeping board members informed of trends, being aware of opportunities for growth, partnerships, joint ventures, etc. Establishing productive relationships with the board and everybody else that's involved in the job. Delivering the strategy, managing the staff and finances, and managing the financial and other resources. That's what it usually says in your job description. The other stuff is the unspoken bits. We want the CEO to be smart, personable and trustworthy, on top of complex policy issues, to have his feet on the ground, but projecting a vision of the future. So this impossible tightrope. We want the CEO to understand the issues for clients, for staff, the minister, the local MPs, major donors, funding bodies, the media, business leaders, potential sponsors, the board, a myriad of relationships that they have to be able to manage and manage well so that there are no complaints. And they have to be able to handle themselves under pressure and tell a good joke. I could have added and feed the board properly at board meetings and make sure the strategic planning thing happens in the Whit Sundays rather than not in the local CWA hall. But this is the sort of bit of the iceberg that's under the water. You know, the bit that loses you your job, even though it's not in the job description. So if you're beginning to feel like it's a tall order, it is. Because I got this list from Judith Brett's description of what we expect of our Prime Minister. Almost exactly the same. And it didn't feel funny when I read it about the CEO, did it? So there you are. My basic thesis is that if you've been the CEO of a non-profit organisation and managed to keep your head above water, you can run the country. No problem. Because you're not only managing all those relationships, you're often doing the stuff that nobody else will do because you're the only one there. I used to say we're cleaning out the rubbish bins one minute and talking to the minister the next, and often in the same clothes. Hopefully they've not got good senses of smell, but it's one of those things. So the unspoken stuff about the job needs somehow to be brought into this equation. There's a few statements about the board-CEO relationship that I think are important to remember, but John Carver gets it, as he often does, very neatly. No single relationship in the organisation is as important as that between the board and its CEO. In my view, a good CEO is the most precious asset. I've said a most precious asset just so you won't argue with me right at the beginning. But, you know, I still think it is your most precious asset. And building this relationship of trust and respect between the board and the CEO is the board's most important job. Not just the CEO's, it's a two-way street. The board has to respect the CEO and find that element of trust that is essential in the doing of the job, and the CEO has to respect the board and think that the board contains wisdom that they can draw on to value add to their job. If your board has ended up rubber stamping everything you do and say, they're not challenging you enough. If the board are doing your job for you, you might as well go somewhere else because they've just essentially made you irrelevant. Finding that middle ground where you're both working in the interests of the organisation and adding value always is the challenge. Your only HR job as a board member is selecting, supporting and assessing the CEO. Those three elements of the job have to be kept right at the top of your head. Apparently Henry Bosch, one of Australia's most influential corporate leaders, said if you can't support the CEO, get off the board. And that's got some interesting dimensions to it too. You either can't support the CEO because you fundamentally disagree with them, or you can't support the CEO because they're doing something corrupt. Either way, out of there. Find reasons to support and make sure that you and the CEO know that that support exists and there are no surprises. The board have certain obligations to their one key employee. They have to provide compensation, benefits and a working atmosphere that makes the CEO's position attractive. And that's a hard ask for lots of boards because most of you are in jobs where there is no end of need and it goes on and on. The working atmosphere can be rendered positive under all sorts of circumstances. On a paper that I'm happy to share with you is called Simply the Best, and it's a paper written by some academics at Sydney University's Centre for Working Life, and they've identified the 15 key drivers of a truly excellent organisation. And if you're really busy, as most of you are, they're all on page 4. So just get to page 4. And the top one, the most important, and they evaluated hundreds and hundreds of organisations that people nominated as excellent places to work. That's for-profit, not-for-profit and public sector. What was the top one, do you reckon? Virtually, yeah. The quality of personal relationships in the workplace. That's what takes us back to work. The money was about number 9, and it was compensation that was seen to be reasonable. Pretty easy. Having fun was on the list too. Very important. And a working relationships and culture that was seen as psychologically safe. It's all this ringing bells. It's a great paper. I really commend it to you if you want it. Sure. Yep. It's called Working Paper 88, Simply the Best. A clear duty statement and performance goals. So before you do anything else, It's not just your job description that comes into play in the assessment. It's what are you supposed to be achieving? If you haven't got a strategy and a clear understanding of what it is you're going to be asked to report on, then your job description won't be the basis for any sort of assessment. You also need regular performance reviews. How many people have been the CEO for some time and not had a performance review? Sometimes happens. How many boards hate the thought of reviewing their CEO? Which is probably why you're here. Okay. The trick is that if you engage in constructive, informal feedback on a regular basis, by the time you get to your performance review, you know what's going to happen. You've sort of done it. It's again the no surprises rule. But it's getting into the habit of providing regular, constructive, informal feedback and making that a sort of norm. If the board's expected to be the sort of backup team for the CEO, running behind the CEO saying yay, yay, yay the whole time, that's not going to happen either. There's an element of being courageous and open in these relationships. One of the best things that the board can do, apart from providing feedback when things go wrong, is recognising things well done. People will walk over hot coals for appreciation. It's really important. And it's just as important for the CEO to appreciate the contributions of the board. Again, it's this two-way street. Respecting the CEO's authority over staff is equally important. If board members interfere in those relationships, they're undermining the CEO's authority and setting the board up for a major crisis collapse. It's really easy to bring an organisation undone. Get a staff member to complain about the CEO to a member of the board, bypass the CEO, and you've started on the downward spiral. That sound familiar? And prompt and thoughtful responses to requests for guidance. So if you have a board where there's expertise in different areas on which the CEO can draw, that's another way in which you can add value to the work of the organisation. You're not being asked to tell the CEO what to do. You're being asked to share your thoughts on this particular aspect of management or relating, and giving the CEO the opportunity to expand their understanding of what's possible. And I'm not just talking about the board chair here, I'm talking about the whole board. Okay, so you're going to assess the CEO. You've girded your loins, you've decided you have to face this bit of your responsibility. The first question to ask is why? Why are you doing this? What do you hope to achieve? So why do you assess the CEO?
We've got a strategic plan in place and we want to make sure that that's being adhered to.
Yep. Great answer, number one. But in fact, you should know that because at monthly meetings or 2 monthly meetings, the report should be against the strategic initiatives and you're gauging progress all year.
To gauge their view of their performance.
Yep.
It's part of the development.
Yes, as part of their development and to gauge the CEO's view of their performance.
And it's the board's job.
And it's the board's job. Do you think assessing the CEO is viewed with dread or pleasure by most CEOs?
It's not emotional.
Not emotional. Apart from people with Asperger's, is it true? Sorry.
I suggest that it should be a pleasant experience, because if not, then somebody's been slacking and hiding the fact that there's something wrong.
Yeah, I agree.
And I take that to the next step by saying it's about the relationship.
Yes, yes, it is. That's why you're doing it, because it's an opportunity to develop the most positive relationship that you should have with your CEO and to come out of that with an enhanced relationship, not a damaged one. If the CEO is avoiding participating in this and the board is avoiding participating in this, there's a few elephants in the room.
Isn't that done yearly?
Should be done every year, yep. Does the board have to do it in the how? Does the board have to actually do this? Yeah, the board have to drive it, the board have to require it, the board have to get the results and talk about that with the CEO, but they don't have to actually physically carry it out. If they're unsure, if they're worried that they might end up damaging the relationship rather than enhancing it, you can outsource it to a third person. And sometimes that intermediary can hear things from board members that the board members aren't willing or unable to share with the CEO. The CEO can share things with the intermediary without thinking, if I say this, they'll fire me. And hopefully the intermediary has a facility with language that makes the results positive and hearable for the audiences of that report.
So under what circumstances would you outsource it when the board felt unsure?
If there's any disagreement amongst board members about whether or not the CEO is actually performing to expectations, if the CEO feels that the relationship is less than optimal and doesn't want to expose themselves to, and because after all you are the employer of the CEO, there's a power relationship there. We can talk about equal liability and equal roles in adding value to the organisation, but ultimately you can fire the CEO and the CEO can't fire you. When I was an academic and I worked in adult education for a while, and there was this sort of mantra there about how we're all equal in the room, and I used to say, that's bollocks, you know. You give your assignments to me and I give you a mark. There's no getting away from that power relationship. But what I can do is say, I don't want to know why you're late. Just tell me you're going to be and when I'll get it. Because I know what your lives are like. Somebody's lost their sneaker and the dog's died and all sorts of things, but I don't have the time to hear it. Just give me a date. We can work openly to a more equal position.
Another time would be if the board doesn't have the technical expertise in some
Yes,
areas.
yes.
So if you have responsibility for a professional or a technical area that you don't have any knowledge about,
Yes.
so outsourcing can be useful.
It's part of what should emerge from your strategy, that when you explore the issues for improvement in the organisation, you need to cover off on operations, management and governance. And where the board needs to improve, you need to make a budgetary allocation for professional advice. So there needs to be some dollars there that the board can draw on to ensure that it can fulfil its obligations. And sometimes that's a lot.
So I've been worrying if the board and the CEO couldn't carry through the review together, because I would then wonder about the CEO's ability to review the staff he was responsible for.
Yes, that's an interesting point. I mean, I do think it signals some anxiety in the relationship. And that would be something that would be worth talking through. The whole issue of approaching this assessment. But again, the power relationship means that the CEO may be unwilling to say, I'm super anxious about this and I'm worried that certain people on the board will influence the outcome.
That's a chair's responsibility then, isn't it?
And CEOs work with a number of different chairs in their lifetime if they spend a lot of time with one organisation. So sometimes it will be fine and other times it will be anxiety.
How many people should be involved in that task of assessment?
If you've got a small standing committee of the board, it's usually the CEO recruitment review and whatever it is, remuneration committee, then that's the job of that committee, and I wouldn't have any more than 2 people on that. And that committee may be able to recruit the services of an HR professional pro bono. So, you know, they don't have to be a board member, and you don't necessarily have to pay for it, but because that's their field of expertise, you might get someone who can add value to your work in that way. The board committees don't have to have all board members on them. And that's always, it's a good reach out sort of strategy for the board too.
It's only a worry if the chairperson is too close to the CEO or just support whatever the CEO wants.
Yes.
If the chairperson is the one who's assessing the CEO, and the rest of the committee will find it very difficult to deal with that.
Yes, I agree with you. And under some circumstances, it's really important for the committee to consist of 3 people if the chair insists on being a member of it, and that is a worry for you as a board member. What should be a positive professional relationship has become a close personal relationship, and that's moved into a realm of danger. And you're wise, because when you think about all the organisational collapses of the last 15, 20 years, most of them have been associated with a corrupt board chair, CEO relationship or other senior management stuff. Enron, HIH, all of them. That's why that whole relationship basis is utterly, utterly fundamental.
So I think you made a point earlier, but often when you get these issues, there's a lot of angst associated with the CEO's evaluations because they get treated like an annual inoculation. So there's no sort of constant discussion taking place in an appropriate form and appropriate structure.
Yes.
During the course of the year.
Yes.
And it becomes this event, you know, once a year, invariably associated with a salary review.
Yes, oh, that was you.
So, you know, sometimes
preempted my next point. Yeah.
Make the dialogue more consistent.
Couldn't agree more. Yes. Under the how, I was very keen to ask you whether that sort of assessment also accompanies the salary review, and if it does, think about separating them out. Because for many of you, it actually doesn't matter how well you're performing, there isn't any more money. So there's nothing much you can do about that. You can get a promise, or, you know, when the ship comes in, you'll get most of it, but it's not ever going to be something you can contract. And it's really, really important for boards to remember that you pay them as much as you possibly can afford, because this is your most precious asset. It's not worth, you know, conniving over $10,000. It's not going to kill you. If $10,000 is going to send the organisation broke, I'd say you're heading there anyway. So keep it in perspective and keep current. For a lot of board members, they're not current with what salaries are payable in the not-for-profit sector. I was talking with the board recently who really thought they were doing their staff a huge favour by the salaries they were paying them. And finally, all I could do was produce a comparison table. And they were getting paid less than builders' labourers. I mean, for unbelievably complex jobs. But because the people on that board were volunteering their time and founders of an organisation that was very close to their heart, they thought that the staff should have an equal commitment to, you know, doing it for almost nothing.
Our organisation actually, the CEO provides a comparative table of Australian statistics for CEOs and puts it into the quartile where the organisation is and comparative CEOs.
Smart CEO. We've got. Yes, it is important to, you know, keep in mind that the job that many CEOs do is far more complex than any CEO's job in the for-profit sector. Just making money, you know, that's a one-line graph. Yours goes all over the shop, and you've got to not only produce impact analysis and return on social investment and reports for government agencies, you've got to make it look as if you've expended everything at the end of the year. You know, you've got to come out with naught down here so that nobody's going to ask you for it back. It's really, you know, that whole business of operating a financially viable organisation and hiding the fact that you're hiving away the endowment fund is really tricky stuff. It's also, I think, a cultural thing that we can say this process of assessment should be emotion-free, but it only is when it's just normalised, that you know how the board feel about you, that you've already had good feedback, that you're doing a good job and they appreciate it. And what they want to do now is not just tick off on their obligation to assess you, but to give you an opportunity to reflect on your achievements and to not forget. You know, you might always be looking at what else you have to achieve, but this is your chance to stop, take a deep breath and think, gee, I've done a fair bit the last 12 months. That's not bad. And there's a few things I could have done better. And maybe if I go to this conference or get some support to do this bit of training next time, I'll feel better about those things that have been a challenge for me. And that developmental conversation can be as valuable to the relationship as anything else. But Tony's right, it shouldn't be a surprise. You shouldn't be sitting outside the headmistress's office waiting for the exam. It's not what that's about. You also shouldn't agree to being involved in an assessment when there is conflict between the CEO and the board. If that's the case, and when organisations ask me to assess the CEO, I say why, I ask all these questions, and they say, well, we're not really happy with, you know, what the CEO's doing, and we're not really sure how well they're managing the staff, and we're not. I think, oh, righto, this is give us a report that gives us some reasons to fire the person, and I won't participate because it's not fair. I say, no, we won't call it a CEO assessment. We'll come in and unpack the relationship, shall we? see what's going on here, and then we'll talk about what else is going on. So the timing of it is vital. And we've already talked about the goal being to enhance the relationship, not damage it, and to add value to the CEO's ability to lead the organisation ever higher, ever better, making more and more money that you can apply to fulfilling your mission. Profit's a lovely word. I don't know why we call ourselves the not-for-profit sector. I'm not not-for-profit.
Not for.
Think developing alternate funding streams so that you can pay your CEO even more is a great motivation to get the CEO going. Let's not mince words. Okay. When things go wrong, one of my favourite expressions, if you're going to be a parent, it helps if you're a grown-up. The same thing can be said of CEOs and board members. It's a professional duty, and it needs to be as objective as possible. Board chairs and CEOs who are best friends, not a good idea. Board chairs and CEOs who are worst enemies, not a good idea. We don't want the playground brought into the boardroom. We need to be able to have full and frank discussion, robust debate, agree to differ, and ultimately the CEO is the professional charged with managing the organisation. They may not manage in exactly the same way you do. And many board members are on boards because they're good managers in their field. And keeping yourselves above that line, keeping yourselves in governance, in the strategic, the higher level, the higher order activities is really hard when you want to dive down below the line and say, well, if I were you, I'd do it this way. And they haven't. Personal agendas versus organisational benefit. If you're trying to steer the organisation into a direction of your preference from the board seat and it's being resisted, there may be very good reason for that. If the CEO is trying to limit the capacity of the organisation because they're control freaks and they're terrified it's going to get out of control if it gets any bigger, there's personal agendas. They're the problem. And you need, that's often where the third person can help expose those issues of concern. When a CEO has a great deal of trouble moving with the growth of the organisation. Case in point, CEO of a really, really effective organisation that services newly arrived refugees and asylum seekers. It's built a fantastic reputation, and the CEO works really hard at developing positive relationships with the newcomers and with other people in town. She sees it as her job to meet every newly arrived refugee, personally. That's the way it's always been, and that's the way she wants it to keep going. The problem with that is that she won't delegate that job to anybody else because it's seen as a power relationship, even though nobody's mentioning the P word. She also is limiting the scope of that organisation to assist more and more people because she's utterly worn out by meeting every plane and every train and every boat and saying hello. And it isn't what the job is. It's way too operational. And we finally got her out of that, but it took a long time. And the board expressed that as, we're not achieving what the board wants the organisation to achieve. And that one bit of behaviour seemed to be what Michael calls the boat anchor, you know, the thing that held everything back. So getting in and really analysing what was happening on a day-to-day level with somebody who wasn't already in a bit of a icky relationship was a valuable thing to do. Perfectionism is not in the job description. It's fine for the CEO to have a bad day every now and then. It's not fine for them to hit anybody when they're having the bad day, but, you know, it's okay. They'll get over it, and it won't be the end of the organisation. I worked with this wonderful, was in a public sector thing where the manager of this particular unit, they did all sorts of events and stuff, was very buzzy and very high-powered and really wanted to deliver good conferences and good events and things, and she was really riding the team to get this next one off the ground. And they all, on the Thursday, they were all crying and carrying on, so she called a meeting and said, okay, I know that I've been really hard on you, I know I've pushed you to the limit, and you're all bawling, you know, and they all thought she was going to say, I'm really sorry. But she didn't. She said, just get over it, will you? We've got Saturday to go. You know? And then you can cry. She was not worried that, you know, a few of them were probably going to go off to HR and complain about her. But she had to get them focused on the main game. And it was really interesting that I keep clicking the wrong thing here, that capacity to just ride roughshod when you need to was something that some of them could cope with and others couldn't. Founder syndrome. This is one of the things that affects quite a number of non-profits, although it's getting less problematic. people who founded the organisation are still there and still on the board and still keeping their hand on the wheel as firmly as they possibly can. Is anybody here on a board or in an organisation where the board chair or a board member has been one of the founders of the organisation? Gee. A lovely man once said, "There's nothing wrong with our board that a good funeral won't fix." Sorry about that, I just loved it.
So how long should the CEO be in their position?
I think if you're not reviewing your future after 5 years with an organisation, you could be getting a bit stale. But if the organisation has grown and shifted and changed and you are re-challenged all the time, there's no reason why you need to move on.
Well, our CEO's been there for over 20 years and we do 5-year reviews.
Yeah, fabulous. And everybody's happy?
Yes.
And things are going well?
Overall, we're looking towards, you know, we're getting, yes, that was the word. That was a question.
What was it?
Succession.
Yes, I know. The thing you need to have in place is what happens if that person gets taken by aliens. You know, you've got, hysteria sets in at that point.
But the question is in terms of, like, in terms of CEO or anyone, if they've come through the ranks of that organisation and got to the position of CEO, they only know the organisation, and that's one of the greatest problems.
Can
Because they've
be.
had no experience outside of that particular organisation.
Yes.
And I think that's the greatest problem, if a CEO's come through that. I prefer that if someone is, well, it used to be with CRA and Rio Tinto, that if you, I work in the mining field, or used to, I'm retired now, but
Right.
if you wanted to progress in the organisation, you had to go, or they used to send you to Voyager or something.
Yeah.
And you would not progress on that basis, because you've learned nothing else and you've got no experience outside. So that creates a problem, not only from the founder syndrome,
Yes.
it's anyone's syndrome.
It's anyone's
You
syndrome,
don't know
yeah.
anything else outside of that organisation, or even that type of organisation.
Yes.
You're in trouble. So
And then
20
you
years is up to my
get
life.
too scared to move on because
You have to move on.
you're stuck there, and so you start bringing out behaviours that are very defensive and not positive about changing the organisation.
So when we're talking about founder syndrome, how do you feel about staff, ex-staff being on board?
Oh no, don't do
Yeah,
Especially disaffected staff. Ooh,
Yeah.
that's short path to complete chaos. Yeah, no, I would write in the, what is it? The Constitution probably, but also in board policies about membership and capacity to stand for the board, that ex-staff members should wait a minimum of 5 to 10 years. And then you might have had the funeral and, you know, all your problems are over.
I was curious about what about the other way from board to staff? Sorry, I know we're getting this track.
I'm a big fan of board term limits, board terms and board term limits written into the Constitution.
But how about a board member becoming a staff member?
Oh, board member becoming a staff
We
member.
talked about staff not coming on the board probably ever or 10 years. What would you think about?
Well, if they leave the board, the problem there is the relationships. And especially if they don't become the CEO, then if they're below the CEO, then the potential to undermine is pretty... I wouldn't be doing it.
You'd be good from employer to employee, wouldn't you?
And it could be, that could be messy.
What about board member as volunteer? I work with 2 groups that have volunteers, and we have some board members who started as volunteers before they come on the board. Is that a conflict with you?
No, it depends on how good they are at wearing the different hats.
Yes.
If they're still a volunteer, and well, for example, I always use the example of a Meals on Wheels organisation. If you've got a volunteer driver below the line and they're a director above the line, then when they're above the line, they're under the direction of the board chair. When they're below the line, they're under the direction of whatever program manager is there. And if Volunteers, I call them unpaid staff. They need to have exactly the same stuff as all other staff, a position description, formal assessments, all that professional development that they need to do their job, and a clear set of responsibilities and delegations that go with doing the job. But they are the CEO and program manager people's responsibility below the line.
Just another question in terms of CEO, what are your thoughts on CEOs being on boards of other organisations?
Again, it depends. I think it can be really valuable for the CEO because putting yourself in the position of a board member, working out what information you really want when you're trying to be strategic and govern and not have the complications of also being in operations, helps sharpen what you give to your board. So it can be, as long as you're on a really good board, it can be immensely valuable. What has happened, and I'm not sure that this is still going on, but for many, many years, particularly in the youth sector for some weird reason, all the workers of one organisation were the board of the other one. And they were all best friends. You know, they all went to rave parties together. I have no idea how they worked it out, but it was terribly problematic. And they're incredibly resistant to governance training.
There's some of that in the crisis housing sector as well. Because if people are perceived to have a particular knowledge which will assist, and it's dirty.
Geez, it's very dirty. How they avoid conflicts of interest when they know that this organisation is tendering for this thingo. I mean, I've literally seen board members download the tender onto the USB and thought, this would be really handy in my day job. Doesn't anybody get it? It's incredible. It's up there, yeah.
I work in the Aboriginal sector.
Yeah.
I'm the director of an organisation, an Aboriginal controlled organisation, community controlled. The thing that we have found is that the board has got a cultural philosophical ethos of the purpose for which they are there. And our CEO, if he did not have that understanding of what is the purpose, what is the cultural philosophical ethos of the purpose for this organisation to be, then we would be at loggerheads probably at every meeting because he is not an Aboriginal.
Interesting.
And what we found is that once the CEO has got that cultural philosophical ethos, that there is just a positive, transformative process that goes, that interacts in the relationship with the board and with the CEO and with the board and the general manager now.
Yes.
And so it makes for a better dynamic in what we're there for and what we do and how we do what we do and why we do what we do.
And do you continually draw on that when you're trying to make decisions? You say, well, why are we here?
Yes.
Okay, yes. I couldn't agree with you more. I think that keeping the main game is the main game. You just make sure, and you refer to it all the time. International Red Cross states its purpose in the short form as to serve the most vulnerable. And that gives them that benchmark of assessment all the time. If we do this, how are we serving the most vulnerable? We often have the benchmark of, well, because there was funding available, you know. If you keep going down there, you can lose your way, lose your purpose, and the CEO just runs from submission to submission without ever getting to reflect on why they're there and what it is they're supposed to be doing.
But that sort of relates to the founder syndrome because most founders are very worried, and it does happen a lot, that the organisation forgets why they started. And that's the biggest worry of any founder, is to see that people are there just to create their own little existence and not to serve the people that they're there to serve. And just looking at the industries, finding aged care industry and faith-based or aged care, is to see it, it's amazing how they just move away and it just becomes another organisation. Possibly not just be another for-profit organisation, because you forget what the purpose is
Why you're there.
and that's why the founders hang around and be a nuisance, because they can be.
But it's also
But they're very worried that
where the
that's what's
founder
gonna
should
happen.
go. And I don't say ditch your founder by any means. I mean, you can't anyway. They've probably got the Order of Australia and you get really bad publicity. Did that. But you can create advisory councils of elders, you know, borrow some lovely constructs from the Aboriginal community and develop different relationships with different groups of people. Once upon a time, our constitutions demanded that a service user be on the board, as though that was somehow where you heard the voice of the consumer. It never worked, and it never will, and if your constitution still says that, get a new one. But if you form advisory panels of the young people that the organisation serves, or the older people that the organisation serves, and that becomes then a couple of meetings a year where they feedback, you report to them, it's part of your accountability structure. You can also form advisory panels depending on the tasks that the organisation has in its strategy for this year. If you're going to be moving into building a new premises or finding a new premises, you need a little working group that's got people who know about property and finding it. They don't have to be on your board, but you need to gather them together for that purpose, give them a terms of reference, time-limited project, and get them to add that value to the work of the organisation. And a little bit further down the track, they might offer to be on the board.
Simple mechanism that we use on our board is we put purpose on every agenda.
Fabulous.
At the very top.
Yep. Keep it up there and keep it current. Review it. If this is our purpose, are we still heading in this direction? If you've got the idea that you might want to go in another direction with another bucket of money, there's no reason why you can't develop a subsidiary organisation and have a different purpose for that bit of it. There's also a hell of a lot of value in thinking about, well, who can we literally work together with to enrich and spread some of the things that we do. I worked with 5 childcare centres when Mr ABC was wandering around, and they wanted to avoid being taken over. They were all community-based. They all had volunteer boards of directors, and the unfortunately named principal of the childcare centre was called the director. They all had, you know, their own ways of operating, and 2 of those directors got together, let's call them principals. The principals got together and said, how can we work together positively to shore ourselves up against the tactics of Mr ABC? And slowly but surely they got the others of the 5 in, because they were all in a relatively close geographical area. And they knew that the tactic was for Mr ABC to move into the street near the community centre, advertise wildly, paint everything in bright colours and cut costs like you wouldn't believe. So it became much cheaper to go to that one. When the community one fell on its face, of course the fees went up and he'd achieved his purpose. What they did was form a new company under which all 5 of them became subsidiary, like programs really. The boards agreed to disband because most of their boards were full of parents, which, you know, I think is fascinating in the childcare industry. They're immediately in a conflict of interest voting on fees that they pay, so I don't know how they can do that, but they decided that they needed a professional board, and they got academics and corporate reps and some grandparents and a few other people who were able to bring some skills to this. And the principals all stayed in position, but they ended up with a corporate services division over here that did all the admin, all the accounting, all the HR, developed a band of relief staff that could go across all 5. the opportunity for the principals and the staff to move into the other organisations and therefore have some job enrichment was there. Fleet buying, joint toy buying. So the cost-benefit analysis of this little exercise was enormous. And then they started making themselves available as industry partners to university research teams in early childhood education and earning fees for that sort of work. And because the principals were no longer doing all the admin and the HR and the blah, 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 they had time to do that stuff. So when you think about, and they're still going strong, and Mr ABC didn't get them. So they kept the main game and the interests of the organisation and the survival way above personal agendas. It's a very powerful organisation, and it's one of my most favourite examples of, you know, how it can go really well when you have... And they all talked about their fears. You know, I'm really frightened that as a principal I'm going to look like a dumb cluck next to you, you know, because you're doing all these language programs and... But none of that was the issue. So it can be really positive. Okay, as the final round, what makes it work? If you've got board development and appraisal on the agenda regularly, the CEO can see that this is a two-way street. It's not just the board's job to appraise the CEO, it's the board's job to appraise itself. And you can demonstrate that culture of problem solving rather than blaming. Because if you have got a culture of problem solving, oh, that went pear-shaped, you know, what do we do better next time, without anybody having a panic, you've got an openness that encourages evaluation. You set targets for the board to achieve and meet them, and have to apologise when you don't. You talk about the difference between strategic and operational matters and constantly check that you've got that right, because it's not a hard and fast line, you know, it's a bit fuzzy there in the middle sometimes, and you need to make sure you've got the things that are important on your agenda. Keep your reporting demands to a minimum. You need to make sure the CEO doesn't feel that they have to apply for their job every month. You know, you don't need to know what meetings they went to. For heaven's sake. Are they achieving the strategy? That's the question. Use the board expertise to add value to the work of the organisation. My other favourite question, if aliens came to take the board away, how much would they pay to get you back? That's a Brian Hurd. It was asked at this conference several years ago, and I continually revisit that question. If you're not adding value, then you're probably adding work. And you really need to do an honest evaluation of where you are in that equation. Which doesn't mean don't ask questions or don't ask for the information you're entitled to have. Definitely doesn't mean that. But keep in mind, you know, how is my presence making a difference to the success of this organisation? Provide support and advice, especially when requested. Know that if a complaint comes in out of left field by a staff member about the CEO directly to the board, your default position is support the CEO. Yes. Unless you have very strong evidence not to do so. And the response has to be, that's our role, there's a grievance procedure, follow it. And pull back to policy whenever you need to. You avoid getting involved in those staff matters, and you avoid that inevitable spiral into dysfunction that happens when you get that one awfully wrong.
But you do need systems in place, don't you, so you actually know what's going on in the organisation, because equally you're only getting good news board meetings.
It's perfectly fine to say, could we have a summary of the feedback from the last 2 years' exit interviews? You don't need to know who they were, but what were the issues? And what did you as the CEO do about them? And it doesn't take a genius to know that if the staff turnover is pretty full on, then something might be going on. You might need to drill down, have a bit of a look at that, especially if there's, 8 bookkeepers in the last 18 months. That's a bit of a clue. Yeah, it's all right, Joe.
What do you think about having a whistleblowers system in place for the larger organisations?
I think you can do it, and there's some firms that provide one. And in a big organisation, that mightn't be a bad idea. In a small one would hope that you're working on the relationship stuff well enough to be able to get that across. That one of the best features of a grievance policy is to empower the CEO, when there's a complaint about them, to contract a third person to investigate. Not a board member, not the CEO. Just bring in, and you might have a community justice person in your local area who would do that, or somebody from community health, it doesn't have to be, but somebody who's got an understanding of the professional need for confidentiality, not your best friend or, CEO's mother or something.
Suggested about the summary of exit interviews over the previous 2 years. In that summary, can you also request the number of declined exit interviews?
Yes, definitely. And who conducted them? Because if the CEO conducted them all and they're all glowing, and you're in a regional area and you've had a chat with one of them at a coffee shop and you know that wasn't the case, I mean, we all know where the intelligence comes from. You need to keep asking questions. And the board can ask that they be redone if you don't trust the data that you've been given by somebody else. You can ask for anything. You can ask for anything that makes the comfort level in compliance adequate. If you're not happy, ask. And you might also have to throw money at it, but do it, don't avoid it. Because all those directors that have been up before the commission are ones who haven't asked questions. Or they've asked questions and they haven't followed up on suspect answers. And you have to support one another. If you've got a CEO who you think is going bad, you have to support one another to keep the board solid and to get the advice you need and to go through the process that you need. Because when it does go bad, it's a minimum of 3 months out of your life. And it's pretty awful. And you need good advice and strength. It doesn't go bad very often, by the way. Most of those complaints about the CEO that I'm asked to investigate are from a disaffected employee or somebody who's about to be performance managed by the CEO, or, it's pretty predictable. But when the CEO has lost it and it needs to be taken away in a small white jacket, it's been pretty awful. It's been pretty awful. And it's an amazing board that can survive that unscathed. And finally, ask the CEO how the board can help and listen to the answer. Don't come with your own solution. Ask and listen hard. Listen as though there's a burglar in the house. Get your listening ears on and you'll find the relationship improves no end. Thank you very much.